right, people might be trickling in a little bit, but we do want to be strict with our time. So we're going to start. This is session 3, and this is room C. So the hashtag for this particular room is C3. So if you do want to, if you're watching us live, and if you want to ask questions or make comments, we're going to try and keep up with those, but this is, so the additional hashtag is C3 for this room. So this panel is called Screen Grab, and I'm really excited about this panel. As an international scholar myself, I'm really excited because we have a bunch of international scholars and people who study communities, groups, individuals who are very often underrepresented, underheard, undervoiced in both the sort of mainstream discourse and even the scientific discourse. So today's panel is looking at the impact of technology, social media, internet-related technologies on activism, on social movements, on community organizing and other different things in many different countries. So I'm hoping that what you will hear from the presenters today is going to be something new that might give you a new outlook on how different underrepresented communities and international communities, engage with these technologies and how they sort of make their own meaning that might not necessarily coincide with the mainstream, the Western sort of flow that we are so used to talking about. So our presenters today are Mahsa Alimardani from the University of Amsterdam, Izul Zulkarnain who's a visiting professor at Hobart and William Smith College, Achim Koch, who is a student at the Graduate Center at CUNY, and Andrea Hackl and Little Miss Hot Mess, who are both doctoral students. Andrea is a doctoral student at AU, and Hot Mess is a doctoral student at NYU. So we got a whole lot of wonderful people for you, and I'm going to give the floor to Mahsa so that she can tell us about the digital repertoires of the women's movement in Iran.
Thanks, Tanya. I'm just going to open up my slideshow, which is not here.
It's somewhere on the...
I have it open. I can not find it. Oh. Sorry, guys.
All right, no worries. Good.
Sorry, that was really sneaky. It was there before. But so I'm talking about the feminist movement and how it sort of takes shape online in Iran. And my background is studying information controls inside of Iran, so a lot of censorship studies and combined with social movement studies. So in particular, my study is sort of inspired by my own personal background, which is looking at my 2 Iranian grandmothers who are very different. But at the same time, I feel like they sort of embody what Iranian feminism is. So my maternal grandmother is kind of a very secular individual. She was, I guess, empowered in a Western sense. She was working all throughout her life. She was educated in Europe. But my paternal grandmother was, she came sort of from a different social class, and she was illiterate, and she never really worked. She was kind of a stay-at-home mom and raised 8 children. But at the same time, one of them was quite traditional, the other one was quite secular and I guess modern in a more mainstream sense. But they both contributed to creating a family that has feminist ideals, and they both sort of embody what Iranian feminism is, which is sort of this combination and hybrid of indigenous feminism combined with a little bit of secular characteristics. And so when the Islamic Revolution happened in Iran, you sort of have this effort of the government trying to impose a traditional sense of femininity, but at the same time, this kind of empowered it in a counterintuitive way. Like because mandatory hijab was enforced, it meant that a lot of traditional women could come out into society and go into universities. And so university rates really kind of increased in ways that didn't occur when there was a secular government in place. And so because of these different sort of opportunities and at the same time these different drawbacks, you have this very unique indigenous form of feminism that has arisen. And so what a lot of feminist scholars inside of Iran say is that women are sort of jumping over the fences and not necessarily being given opportunities by the government or the environment in place, but they've sort of found unique ways to circumvent things and go about opening their own sort of gates, but rather not opening gates, not having the gates open, but rather like jumping over fences. And so what I focus on is how the government tries to control the narrative and the content related to women's rights in Iran. And so cyberspace has proved this great opportunity for, initially when it was introduced in Iran, this great opportunity for Iranian journalists and bloggers to go into this unrestricted space and talk and have their voices heard and blog about issues pertaining to women's rights, women's empowerment. And so it was this liberating territory initially. But once internet controls kind of came into place, it became more and more restricted. And so you have this period during the reformist era when there was this emergence of reformist journalists, female journalists coming and sort of directly asking for certain rights, asking to repeal the unequal laws that are enshrined in the Islamic Constitution. And so there was a crackdown on this in 2006 when there was a cybercrimes bill, and this became a heavily restricted space. The government has tried to sort of create their own narrative around this through various tools. One of them would be social media. For example, you have the supreme leader who's in essence the head of state, who has his own sort of campaign called Khamenei Reyhaneh, which tries to instill his image of what the ideal Iranian woman should be, and sort of the active policies of censorship in the ways that they sort of shut down and filter certain feminist magazines like Zanon, which is one of the oldest ones since the reformist era. And so this has forced a lot of activists to go underground or go into exile. And what I sort of look at are the different platforms now that have become essential to the feminist movement, and one of them is Facebook. Facebook has become this place where a lot of campaigns have emerged, and one that's gained considerable amount of traction is My Stealthy Freedom, which is this campaign that is asking to repeal mandatory hijab for women. And it's kind of become a new movement in the sense that you have women from all sectors of Iranian society coming out and making their presence known. In the research that I'm doing, I looked at amongst the My Stealthy Freedom page and a number of other different pages to sort of look at what kind of content they're putting out and to see where they're located. Are they inside of Iran? Are they outside of Iran? And I'm trying to see if the content that they are talking about and pushing forward in this sort of sphere is either being controlled and blocked inside of Iran or not. And my study showed that 3 of the pages were inside of Iran, 3 of the pages were outside of Iran, but a lot of the content is distributed amongst English Western sources and Iranian diaspora news sources. And it proved that about half of the content was blocked. This is the pie chart of all the blocked content. So it's mainly Iranian diaspora blogs and Iranian diaspora news and Western news that's being discussed by these Facebook pages that deal with things like domestic violence inside of Iran, the mandatory hijab campaign, and equality for men and women that is campaigning to change the constitution. Another part of my study also looked at how 140 Iranian women inside of the country kind of think about how they use the internet and online campaigning to empower themselves. And I asked various questions, and the main takeaways I got were that most of the women who were going online had a lot of political goals and were sort of pushing to voice their opinions on women's rights. And but how they perceive the impact of these online campaigns on actual authorities and changing policies was very little. But on the other side, they sort of saw it coming through in international media and international organizations, and in fact, them putting pressure and changing the quality and the environment towards women's rights, and how restrictive sort of the implementation of policies are on the ground. And yeah, that's kind of a quick overview of what I'm doing. But the main takeaways, I guess, is that Iran has a very empowered feminist society, but the policies aren't necessarily feminist. And the Iranian women's rights discourse is lively despite the fact that there are a lot of controls over the internet and how the information flows in the country. And it relies on a network of transnational advocacy organizations to sort of bring this about, and various different international actors at play. And that's about it. Thank you.
All right, so while our next presenter, Izu, is pulling up his slides, I'm going to briefly introduce his talk. His talk is called Nationalistic Networked Publics, the Use of Social Media as a Nationalistic Platform in Indonesia. So we've just traveled to Iran, now we're moving to Indonesia. And if I could ask the presenters to, if you want to turn the mic towards yourself, but please try to speak into the mic because the quality of the audio on the live stream depends on the mic. Yay? Good. Awesome.
Thank you for coming to this panel. And so I just want to give a brief background about this presentation. This is part of my book project. So my research is actually about Indonesian digital nationalism. So I'm going to talk about nationalist activism using social media platforms in Indonesia. So my presentation today is about a phenomenon in Indonesian social media culture called upacara digital, or digital flag raising ceremony. This ceremony had been organized annually from 2010 to 2014 in celebration of the Indonesian Independence Day on August 17. The organizer of this annual event is a self-described social media activist group called Indonesia Optimists, or Optimistic Indonesia. Hereafter, I will refer to as Optimists. The rationale behind Optimists' motivation to set up the digital ceremony was to counter negative expressions about Indonesia by Indonesian digital generation online, and to share optimism about Indonesian national identity in the digital sphere. Optimism's digital ceremony utilized various social media platforms, particularly Twitter, to promote what the group claims as a new model of nationalism in Indonesia. And I characterize this model as distributed nationalism, a model of digital nationalism that draws attention to the distributive qualities of social media in constructing what I call a nationalist network public, the kind of public that attempt to restructure nationalist conception using network platforms such as social media. And just to be clear, that my presentation here is a critique of Optimism's model of nationalist network public. Here, I will argue that while at the outset, Optimism's exclusive reliance on social media platforms in the group's organization of the ceremony seems to suggest the creation of a progressive popular nationalist movement, it has also exposed the self-indulgence of many Indonesian middle-class people who are detached from the everyday realities of common Indonesians. To explicate this, I frame Optimism's digital ceremony as an instance of what Paulo Gerbaudo calls choreography of assembly, a process of symbolic construction of public space, which facilitates and guides the physical assembling of a highly dispersed and individualized constituency demonstrated in contemporary political activisms. As a choreographed assembly event, Optimism's digital ceremony bears a resemblance to contemporary activisms worldwide, such as the 2011 Egyptian uprising. The similarity can be seen from how the collective leverages the distributed nature of social media to create a loose network of participants with a relaxed form of leadership. While Optimist is the motor behind the ceremony, the group does not position themselves as a leader, but rather as the principal choreographer, involved in setting the scene for the ceremony, just like the figure of a wild Ghanim in the case of 2011 Egyptian protests. What's more, much like the other contemporary social movements, Optimist's ceremony has exploited social media platforms as emotional conduits for nationalist expressions. The proceedings of Optimist's digital ceremony utilize 4 digital platforms: Twitter, Foursquare, Optimist's webpage, and YouTube, with Twitter operating as the primary navigation center. Through its utilization of these platforms, Optimist as a social choreographer condenses the individual sentiments of pride and shared identity of its network public and transforms them into nationalist passions during the proceedings of the digital ceremony. The participants' action was necessary here to transform Twitter, Foursquare, YouTube, and Optimist's website into markers of an affective Indonesian national space. Following Optimist's live tweets, tweeting their own feelings about the ceremony with others using unique Twitter hashtag, clicking icons on the group's website, and checking in at the National Proclamation Monument online were therefore necessary action for people to engage fully in the digital event and to construct a nationalist network public. The result can be quite telling. By Optimist's standard, the first 3 years of its organization were very successful. The ceremonies drew a large amount of online participants, both from the Indonesian region and abroad. The collective was also able to secure high-profile figures as their ceremony speakers and receive a national coverage, as well as accomplish a viral status based on social media's quantitative indicator. During the ceremony, the participants also shared their nationalist and patriotic sentiments explicitly online. Some of them, in fact, went as far as tweeting pictures showing them saluting in front of the monitor while participating in the ceremony. Now, however, there is a glaring difference between Optimist's choreography of assembly and that of contemporary social activisms. The collective's flag-raising ceremony limits its assembly only to the digital realm. So, unlike the emotional condensation facilitated by the We Are Khaled Said Facebook page in Egypt, which led to massive protests in Tahrir Square, the emotional condensation in Optimist's ceremony remains in a symbolic and immaterial state on Optimist's website and its Twitter timeline. In fact, the group publicly states that the ceremony is held solely in the digital format in order to make it progressive and unique, because a physical ceremony is, according to the collective, to quote, hot, tiring, boring, and related to the authoritarian regime, end quote. Now, elsewhere, I explore how, despite its progressive claim, Optimist's digital ceremony still aligns with the authoritarian model of nationalism that the collective seeks to resist. And here I want to add to my critique by arguing that Optimist's insistence on restricting its affective ceremony solely to the digital realm in the name of convenience also speaks to the detachment of many network Indonesian middle-class young people, the main audience of its digital ceremony, from the everyday realities of common Indonesians. To be fair, this may not be Optimist's deliberate intention. However, considering the group's inability to concretely channel the emotional condensation of nationalist spirit that it choreographs beyond its digital ceremony, Optimist's nationalist social media activism and its construction of the nationalist network public do appear to be merely a feel-good activism for its participants, particularly a type of egoistic Indonesian middle class, notoriously known as kelas menengah ngehe, or the middle class quote-unquote assholes. The term kelas menengah ngehe has recently circulated in Indonesian popular discourse to describe a type of Indonesian middle-class individuals who are selfish, overly consumptive, and who have a lack of compassion for poorer, less networked Indonesians. The emergence of this type of middle class is arguably due to steady growth in Indonesia's economy. The kelas menengah ngehe is also a fluid marker for class differentiation in Indonesia. The poor Indonesians use the term to characterize a type of class above them who, to quote, do not want to endure hardship or trouble, end quote. Meanwhile, the prosperous segments of Indonesian populations uses the term as a derogatory identifier for the nouveau riches who flaunt their vulgar behavior. One thing, however, remains constant in the term's usage. The framing of the kelas menengah ngehe is always related to consumption patterns and lifestyle. In this case, social media platforms like Twitter and Foursquare, Optimism's preferred applications for its flag raising ceremony, have become the favorite platforms for the kelas menengah ngehe to display their consumer lifestyle as well as fan their displeasures. The initial image of Twitter as the what I had for lunch medium perfectly caters to many Indonesians' need for social acknowledgement about their middle class status. The platform is also popular among the Indonesian middle class because, as Gerbaudo suggests in his discussion of the elitist Twitter activists in Egypt, it entails a higher level of education and a better knowledge of English language than do other social media platforms like Facebook. Similarly, location-based social media platforms like Foursquare is used to exhibit the Indonesian middle class's high mobility and conspicuous consumption, thus updating their Twitter and Foursquare status when they visit hip, upscale restaurants or cineplexes has become an addictive behavior for some Indonesians to claim and maintain their middle class membership. There's an irony here, because it is the self-indulgence of the kelas menengah ngehe that might have motivated optimistic nationalist social media activism in the first place. This is possibly where the group's imagined audience transforms into a concrete segment of the social classes. When Optimist promoted its model of distributed nationalism by choreographing its annual digital ceremony, the people captivated by this model were the kelas menengah ngehe themselves. The proceedings became an ideal means by which to prove that even though they are self-seeking individuals, they are still nationalist Indonesians. The fact that the ceremony does not require a physical congregation adds to its appeal for the kelas menengah ngehe. In the end, Optimism's digital flag raising ceremony generates a perverse feedback loop where its choreography of assembly functions as a self-comforting activism against the pejorative type of the Indonesian middle class, by the Indonesian middle class, and for the convenience of the Indonesian middle class, with no intentions of being on the streets or intermingling with the other and perhaps lower social classes. Now, I want to close my presentation by pointing out that while my analysis of Optimism's digital flag raising ceremony demonstrates the disconnect between emotional condensation in virtual space and social activism in physical space, it also highlights the belief of the Indonesian digital generation in the promises of both nationalism and the digital as mutually liberating concepts. We can consequently perceive the coupling of national and digital imaginings in Optimism's digital flag raising ceremony as an emergent strategy for the Indonesian digital generation to assert themselves into global digital culture on their own terms. Yet, as we have seen in the case of Optimism's misstep choreography of assembly, this fusion of digital nationalism carries its own problem. In the end, I'm hoping that we may learn something from this case study in an effort to gain a better understanding of the novel circumstances prompted by the global circulation of digital technologies. Thank you.
This is really good, almost perfect timing so far. I really love this panel. People are either early or on time. Let's keep it that way. So our next panelist, while he's pulling up his presentation, Achim is going to talk to us about the year 2015 in Korean online feminism, and he's going to talk to us about two movements against misogyny in the Korean online sphere. And we're going to try and lower the mic to see if we don't break it while we do it. Or you can just take it off. That's
Sure.
easier. And I can take this away so that it doesn't get... We should have done this earlier.
Hi. Please excuse my reading from my laptop. I'll try to act like I'm not. So yeah, my name is Achim, and today I'm going to talk about two online movements related to feminism which happened in South Korea in 2015. I usually try to focus on what people do with the internet and how that is shaping the contemporary South Korean society. And for those of you who are not familiar with the country, it's in East Asia. Oh, sorry. Wait. Yep. This is right. And a very, very brief version of South Korean history is that it has gone through a very fast-paced economic development in the 20th century, driven by a patriarchic military capitalism, which pretty much defines the cultural norms until now. This could mean a lot of things, including gender inequality. This is from the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Report 2015. And in 2013, women were paid 30% less and were employed 23% less than men. And there has been a legislative election just a few days ago, and the ratio of women in the National Assembly is 17%, which is the highest ever in the history of the country. Yay. And also the violence against women is in an alarming state. So among the victims of violent crimes, around 30% were women in the 90s. But however, it has increased to more than 80% in the 2010s. And in 2015, at least one woman was murdered by her partner every 4 days, only counting those reported in the news. So the feminist movement presence was not very impressive in the last decade in South Korea, which is also related to the pervasive misogyny which was addressed by the online movements, which are the topic of this talk. I'll talk more about this later on, but let me just say that the dominant language on the South Korean web is very aggressive towards the minority, including women, and also the word feminist is practically a stigma. And now this hashtag translates to hashtag I am a feminist. For those of you who cannot read or type Korean, that's the link to the Twitter search of this hashtag. And I'm not going to go into very much details, but this hashtag movement was ignited by two mentions of ISIL and feminism together. So this is from a South Korean teenager who eventually joined ISIL after tweeting this. And this is a pop columnist who goes very far to make a comparison based on a very extremely narrow definition of feminism. And also, while people were talking about this on Twitter, there was this other guys who went like, I'm not a feminist, but feminism should blah, blah, blah. So some people started using the hashtag in order to problematize the negative social construction of the term through self-identification as a feminist. And if my data is correct, there were about 5,000 tweets with this hashtag in 2015. So it's not, it wasn't a particularly big movement, but it opened up some interesting discussions, both in quality and volume. So, for example, about 70,000 tweets in about 70,000 tweets included the term feminist or feminism after 2015, compared to less than half from all the time before that. And this also led to offline actions like walks and social gatherings. And I think it's safe to say that this movement laid the ground for this other movement, which is called Megalian. So the name is a compound word of MERS, the virus, and Egalian, referencing Gerard Brandenburg's satire novel Egalia's Daughters, which pictures a society where oppressive gender roles are reversed. Yeah, this is not an important image, but I just wanted to. Anyway, to simplify again, users in the MERS board of dcinside.com, which is a 4chan-like website, were slamming women for bringing the virus to Korea, whereas compassion was being given to male patients. And some female users decided to claim the board in protest to this asymmetric criticism, and they started to flood the board with posts parodying stereotypical statements about men and women with genders reversed, named Megalian literature. So early examples went like this or this, which is both funny and tragic because this is actually what men say about women in Korea. So lots of women started to share their stories both in plain language and also in this Megalian literary style. And many new vocabularies were created, which I'm not going to explain in detail because it's very profane, but many of which refer to the average size of male genitalia, hence the logo. And overseas prostitution trips, which is also a thing in South Korea, and in response to sexist slangs referring to women. Another interesting term which was popularized was safe breakup, pointing to the many occasions of men's violence towards women who broke up with them, including murder, revenge porn, and acid throwing. I'm a bit behind, so I'm gonna skip some of. Okay, so after a massive trolling war, this movement went on to also organize real-life actions, including with donations to women's rights organizations, and some political lobbies, including the ones which problematized revenge porn and led to the recent shutting down of the biggest Korean porn site, which is called Soranet. And yeah, so I guess to put it in Judith Butler's word, such activities, especially the activities of reversing the gender, were a redeployment of language which uses that word but also displays it and points to it, and by doing so becomes an instrument of resistance. And oh God, I should have had 5 minutes now, so I'm gonna like rush. So a lot of what the resistant language of these Megalians refer back comes from this website, which is like the engine of hate in the South Korean web. It's called irba.com, and it's probably most similar to what would result in a combination of the random board of 4chan.org and the Tea Party. And it's a very, very popular site in South Korea. And like 4chan, the massive competition for LOLs constitutes an attention economy, which results in a massive hate speech competition towards the minority, who are depicted as whining free riders. And this website is I guess, a clinical example of how the internet is used in a way which reflects or reinforces gender inequality in South Korea. Some researchers have tried to explain the website's massive popularity, considering its profanity. And to them, this is the authoritarian and submissive subject manifesting itself, which seeks something like a group identity through hate in the absence of the collective goals of the 20th century, which were holding them together, like Cold War anti-communism and military-industrial development. In that sense, I think, I think I'm not gonna skip. So in that sense, sorry, hate, which is the dominant effect in the 21st century South Korea, could also be explained as the other side of the coin, which is the cruel optimism as described by Laurent Ballant. In her book, she refers to cruel optimism as the, to paraphrase, the desire and belief towards a good life, which among other things promises upward mobility, but because of this very belief fails to address the impossible condition of such desire in the current days, which only perpetuates the precarious situation. Similarly, the hate manifested in ilba.com is in a way a desperate attempt to maintain the promise of traditional compensation for hardworking citizens, along the way alienating the minority, but its own submissive belief in the system impairs the ability to perceive that the system is failing to deliver. And one major mechanism this hate is being engendered through is through anonymous online platforms, and I'm getting close to my point now. Such platforms exercise normative power, which results in the selective display and performance of online identities by users. Some might choose not to identify as feminists in order to avoid mansplainers, or in some cases, not disclosing your gender will be very helpful to your actual physical safety. And this is one of the reasons I wanted to bring up the two online movements I mentioned today, which were both started in anonymous or pseudonymous platforms. And I can describe Twitter as a pseudonymous platform because not many people use their real names in South Korean Twitter, relatively. And so these movements problematize and repurpose the sexist language common on the South Korean web in general. And to summarize, the issue of identity was important in both movements. They resulted in an increased volume of discussion on gender, making issues more visible. And this is something I didn't take time to explain, but from both movements came voluntary organizers who did not necessarily have ties or activist backgrounds, but went on to pursue offline actions, some of which involved existing organizations. To close, these two movements are, for me, interesting use cases of anonymous platforms which are leveraged to engage the issue of gender and identity, both online and offline, against certain power structures related to social gender inequality. In other words, cases which could be counterexamples to the apparent tendency of the internet engendering hate, like it is the case in South Korea. Thank you.
Do you want to sit, stand? What do you want to do?
I'm just going to stand then.
Okay, well then the mixed end we'll bring back. So our last two wonderful panelists, Andrea and Little Miss Hot Mess, are going to talk about online platforms, policy designs, and minority expression. And that's a fairly broad title, so I'm sure they'll be more specific about what it is exactly that their research is about.
Okay. For a second? Thank you. I don't really need it. I can just hold it. Thank you. Okay, my name is Andrea Hackl. I'm very excited to be here, and I'm specifically excited to be presenting with Little Miss Hot Mess, who's really been a key force in bringing the real name issue on Facebook to the forefront. So I'm very excited to be here and that we're presenting together. So we will be talking about online platforms, policy designs, and minority expression. And I kind of want to set the stage and talk a little bit about why online platforms matter for minority communities such as LGBTQ communities before I turn it over to Little Miss Hot Mess, who's going to talk more about the My Name Is campaign. So the question at the center of our paper and our study is, how do online platforms and their policy and technological design mediate minority expression, privacy, and safety? And I first want to talk a little bit more about why vulnerable communities rely so much on the online sphere or online platforms in their daily lives. Communicating, associating online, minority communities, specifically in countries with repressive information communication regimes, turn to the online sphere, which is sometimes the only platform they have to communicate, build community, and associate. And of course, in our daily communication, in our daily online communication, minority communities rely on an ecosystem of online platforms, ranging from mainstream social media platforms like Facebook, search intermediaries like Google, as well as platforms that more specifically cater to minority communities. For example, for the LGBTQ community, this might be location-based dating apps such as Grindr, Scruff, or Her. And one of the concerns that has been raised in scholarship is that private internet companies and their policy and technological designs have an increasingly important role in mediating civil liberties, given their very significant user base in a global context. And while we kind of never pay money to use most of these platforms, the use of these platforms, of course, is never free, because we kind of give up our data in exchange for services. And the data collected may range from private information such as real names, as we will see later, to email addresses, to home addresses, to metadata like device information or locational data. And as we will see in a little bit, that has very, very significant implications for minority users. And we want to talk specifically about two examples that kind of exemplify and illustrate how the data collection procedures by online platforms impact the privacy and safety of minority users. The first example I want to discuss is Grindr, which is a very popular gay dating app with a user base of millions of users worldwide. And it is also the largest network among gay, bisexual, and queer men in a global context. And the app allows users to look for other men in their physical surroundings, which of course is based on the collection of locational data, which is on the one hand, of course, a great opportunity for men to meet each other, but on the other hand, raises significant safety concerns. And in 2014, these concerns really kind of reached the public and media discourse when Egyptian LGBTQ activists came out saying, okay, I think police in the country has used locational data to track down gay men. And similar stories like this emerged in other countries, like Russia, for example. And while the company at first remained silent about these claims, they later responded by saying, okay, we're gonna turn off locational data tracking in countries with strong anti-LGBTQ records, and taking not a proactive but a reactive step in protecting the safety of global LGBTQ users. And as we will see in the next example, this kind of response is unfortunately not the norm. And that brings us to the Facebook real name example. In fall 2014, Facebook came under public criticism after a wave of terminations of Facebook accounts belonging to drag queens, transgender individuals, domestic violence victims, and other vulnerable communities. And Facebook had relied on its users to flag those using a fake name. And a user had really taken advantage of this tool to target minority communities. And while Facebook initially did not respond to user concerns about the issue, there were two campaigns, the My Name Is campaign and the Nameless Coalition, who really brought this issue to the forefront and made sure we're all aware of the negative implications of this. And with this, I'm going to turn it over to Little Miss Hot Mess, who's going to talk more about the My Name Is campaign. Thank you.
Thanks. So I'm Little Miss Hot Mess. I'm a drag queen. I'm a organizer with the My Name Is campaign, and I'm also a PhD student in media studies. But today I'm talking mainly sort of from my perspective as someone who organized with this campaign. So Andrea gave some of the background. I just want to say, this started in September of 2014, when a bunch of us drag queens in San Francisco and other major cities were targeted. We sort of immediately came together, started threatening protests, and then quickly got the attention of Facebook. So sort of began this series of negotiations that ended up leading to protests, a lot of meetings, a lot of empty hot air from Facebook, and a few small changes that I'll talk about later. So just to give a little background on how it works, like Andrea said, names policing is primarily based on user reporting. And the idea basically is that Facebook allegedly wants users to use, originally they were saying real names, which was sort of conflated with legal name. And then they changed the policy to say authentic identities that reflect how users are known in real life. So there's a lot of ambiguity still in that definition. And they do rely on user reporting and ID, generally government ID-based verification if you are flagged. And so part of the way that the My Name Is campaign got started is that we were approached by many different communities of users, both in the US, internationally, and I'll talk about some of those in a second. But I also just wanted to sort of emphasize the shock, and trauma might be too big of a word, but the hurt that actually does come from losing access to Facebook. I think for many of us in the US, we see it as a time suck and this platform that a lot of us wish that we could get away from. But what we kept hearing from the people who were contacting us is that this actually was a platform that was critical to organizing. It was critical to building community, to receiving support, especially for users who are otherwise fairly vulnerable. So this is an image from one of our protests at the San Francisco Pride Parade. A lot of the organizing sort of happened in San Francisco because of its proximity to Silicon Valley. We ended up making a lot of headlines internationally as well. And this is just a quick screenshot of the sort of softer tone they took after our initial protests. It used to just, basically originally they would lock users out and then give you the option of giving your legal name, which effectively outed a lot of people, especially queer and trans people who might have been using other names for reasons of privacy. And they've instituted some small changes. So I just wanted to say that this to highlight some of the sort of values that different communities invoke when they sort of make claims for the right to self-determination in using names that may not be their legal identities. So a lot of people talk about authenticity, so queer and trans users, different groups of people of color, ethnic minorities, like I said, Native Americans, African Americans. We heard from Gaelic-speaking communities in both Ireland and Scotland. Many of these communities, their names don't fit to sort of standard Anglo naming conventions. They might include punctuation or spaces or use of nouns, what seem like nouns, proper as part of their names. Safety, so we did hear from a lot of survivors of domestic and sexual violence and other forms of bullying and abuse, political dissidents, especially outside of the US, sex workers and immigrants, for whom being exposed under their legal name could actually have very dangerous repercussions. Sort of other concerns of privacy, we heard from a lot of different professionals in healthcare, the justice system, education, journalism, who maybe didn't share the same safety concerns, but were looking to have a little bit of a buffer between their professional lives and their clients. Of course, issues of autonomy and sort of being able to define yourself, so artists, performers. Underlying that, there are sort of these issues of connectivity, like I mentioned. So this is a platform that's used for resource sharing, support, and also business for a lot of people. A lot of people are required to have a Facebook account as part of their job. And then, of course, expression, that Facebook sort of serves as a contemporary public forum. So I just want to share a couple testimonials. One of the, okay, I'm going to share them really quickly. So one of the things that our campaign did was start to compile, and there's a website, mynameiscampaign.org, that compiles a lot of these testimonials. So this is someone who says, I am a transgender person who has gone through a few periods of testing names out to see if they fit, and ultimately deciding on the nickname my mother gave me when I was a toddler, and the last name I was born with. I have relatives that I am not wanting to be in contact with for safety reasons, and Facebook has allowed these individuals, as well as individuals that I was domestically abused by, to contact me using names I no longer use in my daily life. A lot of these themes came up again and again. Someone who describes not being, who was trans and who was stealth or not out at work, and feared for their physical safety. They also say, on a less dramatic note, the forced name change resulted in losing numerous friends who didn't know who I was, countless missed tags and invites, and a dramatic decline in comments, likes, and variety of people appearing in my newsfeed. So again, things that may not seem super dramatic actually do have large impacts on minority and vulnerable communities. And also we saw that this was often used as a form of harassment, especially towards some of the users I've talked about, and even to just, not just, but to women all around the world who were enduring many different forms of harassment, and this just became yet another form in the arsenal of cyberbullies. So then, just to cover some of the sort of underlying issues, like we've talked about, cyberbullying sort of restricts expression. There's sort of an algorithmic and cultural bias happening here. So without getting too far into it, part of the way that when you're flagged, Facebook evaluates where to send you is through an algorithmic process. So like I said, non-standard names might not pass that, and I think this also sort of speaks to the Silicon Valley monoculture that doesn't really understand many different forms of diversity. There's a sense that realness is complicated, so how we live our lives, even in real life, doesn't necessarily translate conveniently into digital spaces. And that as a feature-rich platform, it's really sort of invoking many different senses of self based on its different features. So there's sort of conflict there. There's a lack of due process. So in a corporate-controlled environment like Facebook, they are really the judge, jury, and executioner. You don't really have much recourse to appeal. And then the sense that Facebook, I think, at best, Facebook is sort of seen as this way of connecting. At worst, it's often seen as an advertising platform. But I think we really need to think about what the real purpose of it is, and why names themselves are an important data point for Facebook beyond selling advertising. So I think integrations with other platforms like Uber as a sort of identity verifier, and then things like the patents that we've seen for assessing people's creditworthiness based on the social graph. So things where Facebook is actually extending further and further into our real and fiduciary lives. And then finally, and I see that, just the sense that Facebook makes the argument that that by using your real name, you are more accountable and more authentic. And I think that there are many studies that show that actually allowing pseudonyms and different forms of speech enable better interactions. So I'll stop there. We have some recommendations that we can talk about maybe in the Q&A. Thank you.
All right, so thank you all so much. Those were some fascinating presentations. Now we have about 21 minutes left for some questions. So I just want to say, to sort of summarize what we've heard, that, it's often easy to imagine the internet as this sort of global space without borders, which enables us all to do all these many things. But actually, it's much more complicated because we have all these cultural differences and all these cultural histories. Histories of misogyny, or histories of, what is safety and being public to some may not be absolutely, or maybe absolutely different to someone else. And even within one country, we may have totally different traditions of feminism and feminist expression and what it means to be feminist, depending on which kind of family you were brought up in, and then how that results in the kind of behavior you might engage in online or offline. So with that, I want to open the floor for questions. If anybody has questions for any of the participants. can't believe you don't have any questions. It's amazing. All right, so I've actually got a question for Achim to start with. So you were talking about both platforms that are sort of, owned and run by Western companies and also local websites. Would you, when you looked at them and looked at the kind of ways that people behaved on them in terms of like these campaigns in reaction to them and what they were caused by, would you say there was a difference in how people sort of present themselves and how they engage with each other on sort of places like Facebook or Twitter, and then also these more local platforms, which are probably mostly entirely in Korean and are run by Korean companies?
Actually, I'm gonna need a few seconds, a few minutes to like articulate. If you have like another question.
I'm going to sort of reiterate the same question and ask Mahsa this question. So in terms of how, when you were talking about sort of the difference between like the English language spaces and, so would you say there's like a different approach to promoting certain ideas or certain, say, feminist perspectives on platforms where there's going to be a international audience as opposed to platforms where the audience is mostly in country?
Yeah, that's a really good question. My study sort of looked at how the Iranian government was reacting to different content in different languages. And so the government is more sensitive towards anything that's in the Persian language. And one of the case studies, I didn't explicitly talk about it, Zanon, which is one of the oldest feminist magazines. It translates early sort of feminist theorists like Mary Wollstonecraft into Persian, and they're quite sensitive towards this, and it's one of the platforms they've made an effort to shut down. Physically, they've shut down their offices, and online, they filtered them and continually harassed the editors and the journalists. So there's that kind of sensitivity towards it, and it intermingles with the fact that the feminism and the issues they're both local and they draw on the wider international context, and it sort of filters it down into the government reacting to it, and then the movement or the different campaigns that are going on in Iran outsource and draw on English content and share it. And obviously there's ubiquitous use of anti-filtering tools that enables most of these movements and these campaigns to persist.
Mm-hmm. So, have an answer?
Yeah, so I guess in a way for the for both the hashtag movement and the Megalian reversing movement, the one of like the main platform for the hashtag movement and the early platform for the like one of the early platform for the other movement were actually Twitter, and I guess it is closely related to the kind of local censorship, which is so there's this thing called defamation law in South Korea. So you can like report something and then it'll be either removed or hidden, but that only applies to like local companies because the South Korean government wouldn't have jurisdiction over Twitter. So, and I guess that might have encouraged more people to rely on foreign platforms in such occasions. I guess in terms of this type of movements, which were relatively small and were concentrated on gender issues. Foreign companies might have provided some safe space in a sense. But then we do have a history of the government trying to collaborate with foreign companies in order to investigate residents, South Korean people. So that's, I guess, another layer to think about as a movement is more geared towards or more politically charged, I would say. Yeah, and just as one thing, foreign platforms were not, of course, like always that great because the Megalian movement had a pretty big problem with Facebook actually because so they were engaged in a very big trolling war in their original website, which is basically a board system. So they moved to Facebook, and then people started flagging the page for removal. So it got removed 3 times, and then it's settled on Megalian 4 now, which is, I guess, something that could happen, but at the same time, those people were really also flagging very sexist pages against women or against homosexuals. And those pages were not really removed that in, I guess, in a symmetrical way. So those are, I guess, tricky issues.
Have any questions from the audience emerged? Oh, wonderful. Great. All right. Go ahead.
Can everyone hear me?
Well, we might actually, just for the sake of the live stream people, yes, if you want to just come up. Because live stream people can't hear us if you want.
That was a great panel. My name's Sam. I guess this question, I'll take Little Miss Hot Mess's bait, and I'm curious to hear about any lessons that you learned as an organizer of My Name Is in dealing with kind of these private platforms that don't really have any direct, don't have to answer to us as citizens always. And also, Mahsa, I'm curious to hear, maybe you could jump off of his response. We'll see. I don't know. And sorry, what's your pronoun? Okay, apologies. Hear about any differences maybe when you're dealing with more, rather than a specific platform, how do we go at a huge cultural, not to say that the two aren't linked, but a cultural issue like misogyny or specific government programs or policies? Thanks.
Some in-depth questions.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think listening to the other panelists, one of the things that I'm thinking about now is that in some ways our campaign was about access to a social media platform. It wasn't about using a social media platform to a specific end. And so in a lot of ways, what we were doing was actually going back to sort of so-called old media. So I think a lot of what made us successful was that, and I'll qualify that success because a lot of things still haven't changed. But a lot of what got us attention was that we were able to grab the mainstream media's attention. I think mainly because anytime 10 or more drag queens come out during the day and threaten to protest, like that's going to be a bit of a spectacle, and the media obviously still like spectacle. So I think a lot of it is still sort of about more traditional ways of taking on corporations and holding them accountable to users. I think that for something like this, developing as much of a technical knowledge as you can is important. And I think, trying to figure out what other forms of social media can be engaged. But in reality, I mean, we used a hashtag, but this was not a Twitter-based campaign. This was not something that was really about social media. It was really about like organizing in person, organizing on listservs, things like that. So yeah, and yeah, I'll stop there.
Well, I think your research and your focus on the real name policy, it does relate a lot to any form of activism that happens in Iran, because I'm not sure if you remember, in 2009 there was a surge of Iranian Facebook users whose last names became Irani, and and that was mainly because they were coming on to public pages, they were participating in forums where the government could easily track and look into it. And so most of the movement and the voices that emerged during that period kind of had this layer of protection. And over the past year or so, a lot of Iranian activists, especially women, have come under threat because of the fact that Facebook is now cracking down on these names and forcing them to change. And with one particular campaign, My Stealthy Freedom, there was a counter-reaction by forces that many thought were part of the Revolutionary Guards inside of Iran. And their campaign was to identify the women who were exposing their hair in the pictures and to go and find them and harass them in real life. And so part of these policies also, they protect other different types of activism and other movements. I'm not sure if that particularly answers your question directly. I think you asked about how these movements are answering to policies, you were saying? Well, the one campaign that I'm looking at quite a bit is just a direct sort of assault on the mandatory hijab policy. And so the very fact that women are making themselves present on this space is sort of inserting itself into dialogue and discourse that's going on at the clerical level in terms of what certain clerics are saying at Friday prayers, even so far as going and targeting the sort of founder of the movement. It's sort of bringing this discourse to the fore and kind of highlighting that, okay, you have women from all social backgrounds, all social classes doing this, and it's being talked about, and it is reverberating a little bit onto what's happening on the streets in terms of how the morality police are sometimes not as strict as they are before. And it's just little pieces of these reactions, which I sort of uncover through interviews and surveys that I'm doing inside of Iran. But yeah.
Do we have another question? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. So that would be a question to Little Miss Hot Mess and Andrea, actually. So you guys you mentioned that what your biggest concern is the vulnerability of the minorities due to the real name policy. I'm wondering, first of all, I think we could broaden that notion on many other social groups. They're not necessarily minorities, like for example, like corporate workers or even students, because there have been lots of cases when actually universities or employers were taking steps as an effect of identifying their employees or students and their activities in social media. But on the other hand, you mentioned that the main cause of real name policy would probably be the willingness to have this sort of authenticity, as you called it. I'm wondering if that's the call for authenticity or security, because we need to weigh that and find a right balance. Because actually I think that on one hand there is security of all of the minorities, but on the other hand there's this broader security, which we probably all know right now, especially with all of the hazards that general wide internet brings, like terrorist hazards and identifying people. So I would like your comment on that issue, where to find that balance.
Thank you. That's a really good question. And I do believe that authenticity and online safety, that those two, that we don't really have to choose one of them, because I think, first of all, who gets to decide what is authentic identity are we really supposed to represent ourselves with only one name, one identity? And who gets to make this decision? Is it really a big company who wants to make money based on our user data? Or is it a more personal choice, which I would think? And I think also, I think the argument that kind of authentic identity kind of ensures online safety is the kind of argument that's brought up a lot by the companies. But for me, I think I would really want to see more research showing that, because I know there's also a lot of research out there saying, okay, real name requirements and authentic identity, quote unquote, does not really ensure online safety. I hope this answers your question.
Yeah, I'll just add that from my dealings with Facebook, I mean, they constantly sort of threw that line back at us, and we're never able to substantiate it with any sort of research that actually showed that real names policies kept people safe. And as I think we showed, with the cyberbullying, we can see how it's a tool actually used to silence people. And then I'll just add to that the way that the policy and the procedures are structured, it's actually incredibly easy to use a pseudonym as long as it sort of as long as it looks like a real sort of English Anglo name. So I mean, anyone can create a fake account with John Smith as the name and do whatever they want. They can harass women, they can go after people they've stalked, they can, bully people. So I think that, it's just this just isn't the way to solve that problem. And I also would add too that on sites like Facebook, you see a lot of community accountability. There's certain tools built in to flag content or to report users and whatnot. But I think that one of the things that Facebook I don't think understands in terms of creating this network of users is that people already have networks and they already have ways of maintaining social relationships. And this, presents new challenges and opportunities, but we know how to be social already. So.
Of course, Facebook wants you to believe that they invented social, so that's how it works for them. No, I mean, I think this is a really good point that actually, society, individuals, countries, cultures are a lot more heterogeneous than some social media platforms would like us to believe, and that, just because they have now 6 or 7 different reactions to a post instead of just one, that still doesn't cover the whole complexity. And just because, to them, whatever they called it real name before, and now they call it whatever authentic, or name you identify as authentic, it probably still doesn't capture the complexity of everything that your name as you use it means to you, right? Because as you said, there are, Native Americans, there are all other kinds of communities that use names in very different ways. There are people who have numeric digits as their middle names, and what do you do with those people? Is that a real name? Well, to them it is. So I think the sort of takeaway for me is that there's a lot more complexity than corporations and sort of governments want to believe there is. And despite them trying to deny it and trying to say that, we've provided for every possible option for your safety and security or for your peace of mind, such as it may be, there's actually a lot more chaos and messiness in this world, and hopefully kind of a better thinking about how we can design these spaces so that they're not just safe, but they also enable discussion, enable different opinions, and being able to bring some of that messiness in a constructive way is the way to go. So we're going to end on this hopeful note, and I want us to give a solid round of applause to our wonderful panelists today. So we're ending the first sort of half day of our wonderful day one of the conference. We're now have a break for food and social. As we said, we know how to do that. So on our location page on the website, you'll find a link to a range of places where you can get food, coffee, and other things that will sustain you until 6 p.m., which is when we will have our first and then second keynote panel. So go ahead, get some air, get some food, get some rest, and we'll see you at 6 p.m. And don't forget about the after party.